Good day, everybody. I'm back. It's been about a year, but I'm back, and I wanted to do something different rather than. I'm going to be ranking the albums of Jethro Tull very soon, but before I did that, I was just thinking I wanted to do something different. So I want to talk about my favorite band of all time, and you wouldn't know that from the title of this video, but I want to tell you 10 things I hate about my favorite band of all time, Pink Floyd. So let me start this, saying clearly so nobody starts typing all caps in the comments section that I'm some fake fan of Pink Floyd. I love Pink Floyd. They're my favorite band. Again, I cannot state that enough. I love the atmosphere. I love the scale, the beauty, the weirdness, everything. I just love. I've got so much of their material. I've seen them live. I've seen solo live. I love them. I really do. But this is why I wanted to make this video, because they are infuriating. They are one band that's just infuriating, and nobody frustrates you more than the people you love sometimes, because you see enormous potential in them. And sometimes they don't live up to it, or if they have lived up to it at some point, they get back into some sort of trap, and I don't really know what it is. So this is not like 10 things that I hate about some random band, okay? I'm not doing that. This is 10 things I hate about one of the greatest bands of all time, my favorite band of all time, Pink Floyd. And I'm not going to go 10 to 1. This is not something like that. I'm just going to start telling you some things that I can't stand, and it happens to be 10 things that makes them feel exhausting. Okay, so I'll say number one. It's not really ranking, but number one, the constant bickering. I mean, Pink Floyd spent so much time fighting with each other that it's a miracle that they ever finished albums, at the time that they did, such as the Final Cut, such as Animals, such as Wish You Were Here, The Wall. Most bands have disagreements and they can move on or whatever. Pink Floyd turned a disagreement into art, just like they would an album. I mean, these people could argue over the emotional intention of a cup of tea or a slice of pie, and the way that they argue with each other was just so passive. You got four highly intelligent men, I believe, that were trapped in this slow, bleeding divorce that lasted for decades. And the worst part of it is that none of it was really nothing but low-level, petty nonsense. I mean, and they have this sophisticated resentment. It's almost like it's almost like intellectual contempt. It's so British. They're so sarcastic. Their arguments, the way they say things or the way that they dismiss each other. And so, it had to be some long, drawn-out craziness. And in 2005, they sort of got back together, and then they couldn't do anything with each other. And here recently, the whole Gilmore and Waters thing again. I once met Robert Plant, and we were talking, and he asked me about Pink Floyd, and I was talking to him, and he's like, "So what do you think about what's going on with them?" Because this was when Dave and Roger were really getting into it, and I said, I think they're both just. I mean, I get it, bands split and stuff like that. I said, but it's like a centuries old European blood feud, and he sort of got a kick out of that, But it's sometimes it's just too much. I don't even really care about all that stuff. Just make music. So we'll say number two. Like, again, I'm not ranking this, but again, another reason. They broke up in 1985. And 1985 is one of those dates that just I mean, the Police, they sort of split that year. I think Van Halen sort of split that year. So Pink Floyd breaking up in '85 is like, I don't know. It hurt more, I think, for them than it did any of these other bands for me. And I loved some Van Halen, and I loved some Police. But this one was, all those were tragic, but to me this was monumental. It was messy. I know Van Halen's was messy. The Police, not so much, maybe. You didn't hear about it so much. But then Pink Floyd, they're one of the greatest bands that ever performed. And, they basically just fell all to pieces in 1985. Arguing in the press and, acting, I'm just going to say silly. They're bands that break up and, you think, well, they gave us some closure, so to speak. Maybe you could think about Led Zeppelin in that way. But Pink Floyd, they gave us a headache, and it's so funny because you're a Pink Floyd fan, and it didn't feel like the end of a mighty creative force anymore. It felt like a collapse of like this corporation where the CEO, he went crazy or something. And I'm talking about Roger in that regard. But it was just, I get it. There's creative differences, but, you get out there in the press and you start putting each other down like each other didn't matter. Oh, Dave, I did it all. And then Dave is saying, well, we're better off without Roger, and nonsense. Roger didn't do it all, and they weren't better off without Roger. I mean, all of their great albums featured Roger to me, and I, as much as I love Momentary Lapse of Reason and especially the Division Bell, those albums were great to me, but they didn't, they weren't the quality of Animals, or Dark Side of the Moon. So, number 3, and that sort of brings it to this point, is they never reunited for a tour. And I know they got together in 2005, but this one sort of hurts because, they were always available. It was always possible, you thought, even though they argued so much. And then in 2005, they gave us Live 8, which was a wonderful, historic, emotional concert show. I mean, it was only a few songs. What was it, like 5 minutes long? But it was something the fans wanted, and they gave it to us. And then suddenly it's like being stranded in the desert, because you're waiting. You're thinking, surely they'll do something now, Roger seems a little bit sane now, and Dave seems a little bit more forgiving, and, you thought, well, maybe they won't do an album, but maybe they'll do a tour, I'd like to have went and seen Roger and Dave at the same time, and to have that instead of having to see them separately. And so, you're thinking, you're telling me one of the biggest rock bands in the history of rock and roll with one of the most devoted fan bases on earth could not manage one real reunion tour. Not one. Not even a limited run. Not even a few major cities, that people could... I mean, Van Halen did it. I mean, they hated each other. Guns N' Roses did it. All these bands, Led Zeppelin, got back together. But not Pink Floyd. No, they wouldn't do it. Other bands can reunite when they can barely stand each other and even can barely stand upright, and they haven't made a decent album in 30 years. But Pink Floyd could have sold out the planet Earth and still acted like the idea of a tour was beneath the dignity of the conversation. You know, it's so typical of them. And every fan knows, you know, we know what that meant. And it means the egos of these people were bigger than their music. The egos were bigger than Pink Floyd. And that's just maddening to me. It's maddening to me. Several bands who hated each other got back together. But because this, you know, was not a case of couldn't, it's just a case of, nah, we're not going to do that. We're not going to, even though we don't even really hate each other at that moment, we're not going to do it. So to me, you know, that was a major disappointment. And it was hard to forgive them for that. So number 4, I'm going to say Roger Waters' ego. Now, I'm going to get to Dave in a minute. But Roger Waters is one of those men where you have to say 2 things at once, you know, or people just lose their minds. You know, he's brilliant. We know that. Yes, and he's so creative. But he's also unbelievably insufferable sometimes. I mean, his songwriting vision and his conceptual themes and his ambition and, you know, that helped make Pink Floyd what it was. That helped make Pink Floyd become a major player on the scene, you know. But Roger, I just don't think he wanted. I know he says the group was lazy and he, you know, they didn't want to contribute. I don't think he really wanted them to. I think he really wanted to dominate it. He really wanted to control. He has one of those personalities, you know, and especially back then. And, you know, he you know, got to have the last word of everyone in a 20-mile radius, you know. But I think by a certain point, you know, he wasn't really acting like a member of the band. He was acting like he was the band. He was Pink Floyd. And I think that played out, you know, when they broke up and he tried to sue them after he said, yeah, I'm not going to be in the band anymore and you guys just do what you want, because he didn't think they would do it. But they did do it, and it made him angry, and so, you know, he went after them. But I feel like, you know, when he started dominating the band, some of those albums were great. I mean, the Animals album and the Wall album were great. I mean, I even liked the Final Cut. But that the collaboration was gone, you know, especially after Animals. And they just started sounding, you know, like a one-man show, in other words. And I really believe that's what it became. You know, and Roger's problem's not talent. I mean, he's got talent. We all know that. But, you know, he just became unbearable, you know, to deal with. And I think you can tell that in some of his solo projects. You know, the mumbling, the talking mumble. And then he gets loud. And then there's the lady singing in the background and singing most of it while he's talking most of it. Not a lot of music, you know. It's more about his poetry. It's almost like spoken poetry to music. That's basically his solo efforts. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy some of his solo work, same as I do Dave. But it's sort of like the more aware he became of things in the world, and you know, the less room I think he seemed willing to leave for anybody else to even breathe, unless he told them when and how, you know. And this is very much Roger Waters. You know, you're right, some of the greatest albums ever made, and then somehow you still make everybody tired and exhausted. So now let's get to Dave and David Gilmour's apathy. We'll say number 5. David Gilmour's apathy. Now, what am I talking about? We're talking about the other side of the equation, where Roger Waters was always beating people down, let's just say, David Gilmour sort of had the exact opposite problem. So, Roger is too much to handle sometimes. But David Gilmour, it can feel like he is not even there sometimes. Gilmour's like one of the most talented guitarists who ever lived. The emotive way that he plays, he can say more in 4 notes than most musicians say in their entire career. He brought a beauty and a restraint to the band and an atmosphere to the band. That was Dave. That Floyd atmosphere. That was Dave and Rick, But sometimes, he gave off the vibe of a man who just couldn't be bothered, to fully engage unless the moon was at the correct angle and, someone handed him a perfectly tuned black Strat, So I call it his apathy, but it just seemed like he was just so dismissive. There are moments when you want to grab him by the shoulders and say, look, Dave, please, care aggressively for 10 consecutive minutes. Will you just care? Because sometimes his whole posture, towards the band and the band's history even, it just feels detached. Like he's this elegant survivor of a giant shipwreck, and he's like smoking quietly on the shore and refusing to discuss the bodies. So Roger is all fire. We know that. He's all fire. He's all ego and his grand declarations and singing about war and daddy and whatever, And Gilmour can swing so far in the other direction that it becomes frustrating, in its own kind of way. It's kind of this aristocratic shrug, It's very English. I'll give him that. But the fans are sort of left caught in the middle of it, of both of them. And one guy cares too much, it seems like, in the worst possible way, that he's going to tell you everything in, 20,000 words on an album. And the other seems like he's too cool to care sometimes, It's the most Pink Floyd problem imaginable. It's just, Number 6, the firing of Rick Wright. This is one of the ugliest things Pink Floyd ever did, besides their treatment of Syd Barrett, I will say. And I'd add that to this, the treatment of Syd and Rick. But no amount of how great the band was, none of that changes what happened. And Rick Wright he was not some disposable extra. He was not a session musician. He became a session musician because he was fired, but he was an essential piece of Pink Floyd. He was the soul, the heart. Well, I say the heart. David Gilmour's the soul. He was the heart of Pink Floyd. And there's this haunted elegance about him. This space, this mood, mystery about Rick. And, he was part of the band like a dream, instead of a lecture like Roger, and during the Wall period, he just, you're pushed out. And I know why. I know he even said he was being lazy, but it wasn't even respectful. They kept him in and he made money, and the rest of the band lost money on the Wall shows, and that was great, great, but he's a founding member of Pink Floyd, and he's reduced to a hired hand, on one of the biggest albums they ever made. That's just brutal. It's like firing one of the architects halfway through the building, and then asking him to sell tickets in the gift shop. Well, he made some money, and that's great. But what does that say about the legacy of Pink Floyd? And I think what makes it worse is how cold the whole thing just felt. It was not, it was not just a business move. It had that personal, personal chill to it. A humiliation almost. And as a fan, you don't like that. You hate it. Because Rick Wright, to me, he represents something in Pink Floyd that Pink Floyd needed. Something that Pink Floyd, again, it was the band's beauty, the gentleness of Floyd. And instead of honoring that, they treated him like a problem to be managed. And Gilmour wasn't, he wasn't innocent in this as well. So, it was just nasty. And that's what makes it worse. Number 7 is Gilmour ignoring Animals and the early stuff when he would play. That drives me crazy because it feels like Pink Floyd sometimes behaves like, one of those actors that only wants to talk about the movie that won the Academy Award. And they're not interested in the interesting work that made them great in the first place. And Animals is not some minor side note, okay? It's one of the best albums that they ever made, and it's my favorite Pink Floyd album. It's tough. It's a muscular album, full of teeth, It's Pink Floyd at their most bitter and focused. And it's the best prog album Pink Floyd ever made, I feel. People say Wish You Were Here, but, and everybody talks about Dark Side and The Wall. But Animals, to me, that was it. That was great. And then there's the early material he ignores. He said he didn't want to play Echoes again because Rick passed away. Well, he wouldn't even play Echoes, once or twice when Rick was playing. He didn't. He totally wanted to ignore anything pre-Dark Side. Usually, he did play a couple of songs here and there, but he didn't. It was like that didn't even exist. Let's just play A Momentary Lapse of Reason and Division Bell and the hits. That was Dave, and that's one thing I appreciated about Roger. He did play some of the early stuff, and he did play Animals. So. We loved Animals, Dave. We wanted to hear you play dogs. You didn't have to play sheep. You didn't have to play pigs if you didn't want to, but dogs? Come on, man. And Echoes? You can't play that? Okay, you played Fat Old Son. Great. I love that. I'm so glad you did that. But ignoring that other stuff, it feels like somebody's editing the family history, photoshopping some, Uncle Joe out of the photo, the family photo. It's bad. Number 8, on the same thing, their dismissal of Adam Hartmuther, the whole band. This is one of those personally that aggravates me because in such a glorious, weird way, Adam Hartmuther is so good. It's probably my second or third favorite album Pink Floyd made. I love it. But it's like the whole band dismisses that. Roger Waters calls it rubbish. And David Gilmour, I'm not going to play that. Roger Waters, I wouldn't play it for £1,000,000. Later on, I think Dave did play he did play it at some point again, the Adam Hartmuther suite. And he did incorporate Fat Old Son into some of his solo ventures. But, Adam Hartmuther was a great album to me. I love it. And it's not just that, it's just the way that the whole band dismissed it. And so I will say this: when Nick came out with his band and he's playing, he did play some of Adam Hart Mother. He did play some of the earlier stuff like that. But the way that they just dismissed Adam Hart Mother, to me, was just sad. It's not something to be ashamed of. That I love that album. That honestly, like, their comments about it have sort of like this tone of rich people apologizing for an old house that they own before they learned what marble countertops were. So fans of Pink Floyd are just kind of like, no, that house had character. We enjoyed being there. You don't have to pretend that it's your finest achievement, but maybe stop talking about it like, it wandered into the room drunk and ruined Thanksgiving. It was a great album, okay? So, and that moves me to, I guess, number 9, their eventual laziness. At some point, Pink Floyd went from a band being an occasional, releasing albums, boom, 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 to the output slowed down so much that a fan started to feel like, you've subscribed to this, what is it they used to call it, where you would get a home. I can't even think of it now. I'm so frustrated. The timeshares, but you never could go. It's just weird. I don't know. But look, I understand not every band has to produce endlessly. And as you get older, I get it. You're not going to come out with with an album every 2 years. I get that. But, Pink Floyd had so much to offer, I feel like, that they could have made a little bit better. Made a little bit more with the material. Because, even with, after Roger left, you go from 1983 to 1987. I get it. They had a feud going on, and that was tough. But then after 87, you had 7 years until the Division Bell. 7 years. And then you think that's bad. They didn't come out with another album until 20 years later with The Endless River. And that just felt half effort. It really did. It felt like they put a bunch of clips together and just said, let's just throw this out here to the fans. No. Put some effort into it, guys. I get it that it was to honor Rick. I love that. But the treatment of the Endless River, to me, that's number 10, by the way. The treatment of the Endless River. Nothing about this album should have been so casual. You made us wait 20 years to build an album around Rick Wright's presence, who had already passed. This should have been treated like a sacred object. It should have been deliberate and worthy of being a Pink Floyd album. But instead, the Endless River feels like somebody, found a beautiful treasure box in the attic, and then they dusted it off, and then they forgot to check whether there was actually enough inside to justify presenting it as a gift. To be fair of it, parts are beautiful. It has the texture, it has, the moods, and it does sound like Pink Floyd, but the whole thing just carries this strangeness to it, to me, because no one stopped to say this should have been better. We should have put something more into this. And that's the frustration that I felt when I listened to that album. I was excited when it came out, and then to hear it, and it sounds like just music clips off CD Baby until you get to the final song, which was a big letdown to me. you know, they should have just ended it on High Hopes. High Hopes was, you know, that's the way you go out as a band. If you're not going to put more into the Endless River, you should have just went out on High Hopes, because that was the song that should have finished Pink Floyd. If they were never going to come back again, that's the song that should have finished them. So I said all that, and the 10 reasons. I do not hate Pink Floyd, and anybody that knows me knows better than that. But I hate that they were brilliant enough to be better than that. You know, I hate that one of the greatest bands in the history of music spent so much time acting like school children and acting like each other were some sort of disease. You know, I hate that their catalog is so full of masterpieces, but the story is so wasteful. I mean, of course they proved they were one of the greatest bands of all time. They don't have to prove anything to us. We know who they are. We know how great they were. But that's why Pink Floyd is so frustrating, because they could have been something even greater, and they just sort of piddled it away. But you know what? I still love those guys. I still love Pink Floyd. I still love the music. And as frustrating as they are, Pink Floyd is still my favorite band, and to me, the greatest band of all time. You guys, I'll have another video soon, but until then, you guys take care.